Hey historians, this is your virtual video for Tuesday, October 27th. As you can probably tell, I'm not in Chesapeake today. I'm out in the western part of the state in what's called Bath County, kind of near the town of Stanton, but way out in the country. As you can see, the gnats landing on my glasses. If you look behind me, you see the mountains, obviously, and farther behind me, as the sign says, you can walk out to the Cowpasture River. Now I'm not going to do that because it would take a long time to videotape that, but I'm going to walk over here in the light so you can see me better, because my videographer says I need to be in the light. He says to come back over here. So, okay, in the background over here, this building was once a mill, and it has been renovated into, now it's basically like a small restaurant or inn. The place I'm at is a place called Fort Lewis Lodge. Fort Lewis Lodge is on the grounds of the original Fort Lewis, which is what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to have my videographer, which is Mr. Benfonte. Everybody say, hey, Mr. Benfonte, and just just pan around while I talk for a minute. Okay, so we're out here. We're kind of where the Blue Ridge, which is behind us, meets the Allegheny Mountains and creates a lot of narrow valleys. And out here at Fort Lewis, there was nothing out here but Native American people for a long time, maybe like 10,000 years. But eventually, as England realized they wanted to bring in more settlers, not just English settlers who were members of the Church of England, or what we now call Anglican or Episcopalian, they knew they needed to bring in different people to populate, because one of the things they were very concerned about in this part of the colonies, the Virginia colony, was that just north and west of here, the French have settled and made allies of the Native Americans in the Ohio River Valley. And they were very concerned about the French moving into this region. So they wanted more English-speaking Anglican people in this region as a buffer for the French and their native allies. Now, when the state, or the colony, started to relax their laws about being a member of the Anglican Church, the Church of England, more people could come here. You didn't have to be an Anglican to come out in this part of the state of Virginia and make a homestead here. Everyone in Virginia at this time had to pay tax to the Church of England. So even though you were coming here and you weren't necessarily an English person and you weren't Anglican, you still had to pay tax to the church, not to the colonial government, but to the church. But a large group of people that chose to come here are called Scots-Irish. Now, they were actually just Irish. They weren't Scottish at all, but they got tagged with this label, the Scots-Irish, and they were definitely not Anglican. They were Catholic, but they were allowed to move into this area and make settlements. And that's where the Lewis family comes into the picture for the first time. And they came, and one of the Lewis family members by the name of Charles Lewis got a job working for a man who had received a huge land grant in this area, over 40,000 acres of land to settle people on, to start villages on, to create this presence, okay? And it's on the Cowpasture River. And that's kind of a funny name, a Cowpasture River. What does that mean? But interestingly enough, in this region, we also have the Bullpasture River and the Calfpasture River. No one's really sure where those names came from. There are a lot of stories, but no good history on it. Some people said they were Native American words that were translated into cow pasture, calf pasture, and bull pasture. Other people said it was the most early colonists that came out here, and they had set up different pastures on these different rivers for their stock. But again, it's all just stories. There's no actual historical evidence that tells us why, but it is kind of great names for these rivers in this region. Obviously, we're out here in a valley with the Appalachians on one side, and if we traveled off that way, we'd get to the Allegheny Mountains. This is a little different than the rest of the state, which is more rolling mountains and less sharp valleys, which is what they have in this region. And so when because in Ireland at this time they had a number of famines, they also had religious persecution for being Catholic, and so there was quite a willingness to come here from the Irish. So the Irish, like the Lewis family, settled in this area, and they, like I said, Virginia needed the people here to prevent anyone else from coming here that they didn't want here. And so it's in this environment that we have the Lewises, and it was around 1728 that John Lewis and his son Charles were the first to come here, and then eventually the rest of the family would come. The reason John Lewis left Ireland was because he had had a dispute with a landlord that led to violence against his family. And John Lewis, because there was actual gunfire at his home when he was not there, he went to find the landlord that had done that, and he took with him what's called a shillelagh. And a shillelagh is an Irish club. And he went and he had some kind of dispute in person with this landlord, and he ended up hitting him with the club in the head. His report, it was self-defense, but that's just his report. We don't know the whole story. But he ended up killing him. So John Lewis actually had to flee Ireland with a murder charge on his head. So that's why he came to the colonies. That was the main reason. So he came out here, and he was 50 years old when he fled to America, and he came with his wife, Margaret, and their 5 children. When they got here, Margaret's brother already lived here, and so that made, in Eastern Virginia, and so that made their transition a little easier. But John Lewis quickly got involved in land speculation, in the helping out of granting properties to the new colonists coming in, as he was one of the early Irish ones. So they settled in this upper Shenandoah Valley area, just outside of the city of Stanton. That was in 1738, and a man named William Beverly, an Englishman, was granted this large swath of acreage. Eventually it grew to 118,000 acres that he could develop. And so John Lewis became his land agent. And that was a great thing for the Lewis family, because they were able to acquire one of the first tracts of land out here on the Cowpasture River. And he actually only paid 14 pounds, which would be, like $20 in American money. So he paid almost nothing to our mind for this land. And actually it was the largest grant made out of this tract of land. And so not only did he work as a land agent, his 2 sons trained to be land surveyors. And if you remember, that was George Washington's original profession, being a land surveyor. And George Washington was not part of the gentry or the aristocracy of Virginia, but being a surveyor, and Thomas Jefferson was also a surveyor early in his life. A surveyor was a great position to rise up in the class society. George Washington also married the wealthy Martha Custis, who would become Martha Washington. But everybody knew that the king knew and told everybody that the key to bringing order, which was the goal, and commercial success, because everybody wants to make money, right, to this part of the frontier, because this was just the frontier back then, was to control the land. And John Lewis certainly knew that. And so with himself working for Beverly and portioning out the land, and his sons being surveyors and rising up in the social ranks, giving them an advantage in selecting and distributing all this land, because they knew the most about it. And so they rose up because they were surveyors. And so they settled in this area, this beautiful area. And this guy will just, Mr. Benfonte will just kind of pan around one more time so we can kind of see all of it, how beautiful it is out here. Like I said, this building over here was once a mill. Just the bottom part is all that's left. I'm going to talk about that in another video. So a small settlement sprung up out here on the Cowpasture River. And so civilization had come to the frontier. There are now small settlements, kind of small villages in the area. And there weren't, when they arrived here, there were not any Native Americans in this particular valley. We really don't know why. We don't know if it was pressure from other native tribes. We don't know if it was because of the encroaching English settlement that, for whatever reason, the Native Americans in this area who had established semi-permanent permanent villages and also created large burial mounds, but they moved on. And so when they arrived here, there was originally no conflict with any native people when they first got here. And so within a few short years, the Lewis brothers had surveyed the area and had some thriving settlements dotted around the countryside. So now we have some civilization out here and things are peaceful. When tribes passed through, they were peaceful as well. But then in the 1750s, everything changed. The Shawnee Shawnee native people, the indigenous people, started to move into this region and establish villages. The English people in the region did not want the Shawnee people here, and so they attacked their villages and created this difficulty with the local tribes. Now, it's hard to imagine living in Virginia and being afraid to go to church or to go to the local schoolhouse or even to go visit your neighbor. But that's how it was in this time, in about 1754, right? You know, on the eve of the American Revolution. But we start having very savage raids on some of the settlements out here. And they're all, you know, far apart from each other. There's not a lot of way to get help to people before they are attacked. And around the same time, we have England and France and some other countries in Europe launching a global war, which we've already talked about that. It's the 7 Years' War that lasted 9 years, or we call it in America the French and Indian War. And here in the Shenandoah Valley, and points to the west of here, out towards West Virginia, which is all part of Virginia right now, the frontier is in chaos now because we have Indian tribes coming that are hostile, and we have a war happening as well. And so, as we learned, to bring order to the frontier, the Virginia governor put Colonel George Washington in charge of all of Virginia's forces and asked him to oversee the construction of a chain of forts 20 to 30 miles apart along this disputed area through the Allegheny Mountains. So this Lewis land that we're standing on the Cowpasture River became one of these forts, one of these fortified dwellings, which was, as far as we can tell, there's no archaeological evidence on this site. They've looked and tried to find, you know, a footprint or some evidence of where the original stockade was, but they haven't succeeded in that as of yet. It's an ongoing thing. But we know from the records that they built a stockade, and a stockade is basically 4 walls that are logs, big thick logs that are sharpened to a point at the top, and they can prevent a bullet from passing through. That's what they're made that way for. One small entrance to come in and be safe inside of that. So the Fort Lewis was a stockade on the Lewis land out here in Western Virginia in what was still the frontier. And nearby families could come, and just like back in the days, if you studied world history, you know, back in the day, the lords would have a castle where the local people could come and hide in the castle. Well, Fort Lewis was like that. The people on surrounding properties, on surrounding tract of land could, as fast as they could come, would come out and go in the stockade to be safe from Indian attack. Now, John Lewis's son Charles became an important man over time in this part of Virginia, and he actually lived the frontier life as a young man. He came of age just as this area kind of erupted in all this conflict. He was known as a woodsman. He liked to be out in the woods hunting and exploring, and he was known for wearing buckskin shirts and pants. And even though he was officially part of the militia out here, they didn't wear uniforms. They carried tomahawks and they carried long rifles, and they knew their way around the forest as well as any of the Native Americans. So Charles Lewis establishes a farm. They grew hemp, which was used for making rope, and they grew flax. And so for the rest of Charles's life, he's going to live this dual existence of being a farmer and then being a soldier. He was often sent to the various forts in the area to check them out for the local government, and he also spent a lot of time being called out to backcountry settlements that didn't have a fort to help defend them. So he was something of a war hero. But by 1962, things had calmed down, and his duties as a soldier kind of went away, and he was able just to go back to being a peaceful farmer on his land. And he kind of tried to settle in that life. He got married to a lady named Sarah, and they moved here permanently for them onto this land right near their fort, Fort Lewis. And so they were settled, they started having children, but then his farm life was shattered when in 1763, a Shawnee raiding party under the leadership of a chief named Cornstalk in American, or Kitugwa in their language, started attacking and creating a lot of havoc and casualties in the western part of the Cowpasture River. And again, Fort Lewis reopened, and Charles was called back into the militia. Eventually, we have the British trying to move into the Ohio Valley, which is creating more conflict. And so he gets into the regular army and becomes Captain Lewis. And that would be his role in the next campaign to restore peace to the frontier. Sorry, I gotta turn the page in my notes. I don't have all this memorized just yet. So as there is a particular bad area where the Shawnee have been attacking a lot, and Virginia's Lord Dunmore, who we talked about before when we were talking about colonial Williamsburg, he was the last British governor to live in the palace there at Williamsburg. He sent a letter out to Charles Lewis's son, Andrew, that they needed a body of men, that the fort needed to be fortified, and they needed to start a campaign against the Indians. They needed to stop playing defense and go on offense. So Andrew stays home. Charles goes off to fight. He departed here, Fort Lewis, August 10th, 1774. Before he left, he wrote out his will, leaving everything to his wife and his sons. And he gathered a lot of provisions and 600 men. This is a sign of popularity of Charles Lewis in this area, that 600 men were willing to follow him out into the conflict. And they went to Camp Union, which is now Lewisburg, West Virginia, because of course there was no West Virginia yet. There won't be a West Virginia until the Civil War. They take 600 men and all their provisions and tools out through uncharted wilderness. Took them 17 days to trek just 100 miles. The wilderness was thick and rough. And where the Kanawha River empties into the Ohio River, that's where they met up with Lord Dunmore's troops along the mouth of the Hocking River. They wanted to negotiate peace with Native Americans. That was their goal, but no chiefs had come, so they couldn't negotiate with anyone. And actually, the Shawnee really had not wanted to speak to the Americans, and they were able instead to surprise Andrew Lewis's 2 regiments that he had with him at that point at a place called Point Pleasant. And early in the morning, 2 Virginians ran to their camp and warned that there was a large group of Shawnee Indians coming, or Shawnee natives coming towards them. And the 2 regiments that were there began marching upriver, but they were soon surprised by a large number of native warriors that were hiding behind trees and bushes, and the battle was on, and there was fierce fighting. But within the first minutes of the battle, Charles Lewis was mortally wounded, and he was only 38 years old when he died of his wounds. But by the time the end day ended, the battle had turned in favor of the Americans, and the losses were very high. 1/4 of all the Virginian troops were killed or wounded. Sarah Lewis, Charles's wife, suffered probably as much as anyone else. Her husband, her brother, and her half-brother all perished inside the compound at Point Pleasant, out in what is now West Virginia. And soon after the Battle of Point Pleasant, the world changed and the colonies will go to war with the British. This Point Pleasant battle will be the last battle before the battle at Lexington and Concord that will kick off the American Revolution. So that's pretty much it today, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this place, what Fort Lewis is now. Fort Lewis is now called Fort Lewis Lodge. And if you look, this building over here is like a hotel building. There's rooms in that building. This is their restaurant where they serve breakfast and dinner every day, which is all included in part of this. And I want to just walk up the road here real quick and kind of look at what else there is. But you can come and stay here only in the spring, summer, and early fall. They close at the end of October because of the weather, and they won't open again until April. But there's a family that runs this place, and they run it not just as an inn, it's also a working cattle farm out here in Western Virginia. The cattle fields are over here. We'll walk over there in just one second. I want to come up here so you can kind of see one of the log cabins up a little bit, or maybe we'll walk around the building. That's what we'll do. We'll come this way, we'll walk around the building, so we'll see the cows, and then we'll see the log cabins, and then we'll be done for today. There's going to be another video attached after this one that will talk more about the mill. It's just a little short video, and I'm also going to attach some pictures of various things up here that are kind of interesting. You should tell your parents you want to go on family vacation out here. Okay, we're going to start another video in just a minute.